Hello there, welcome to another Unity tutorial. So in this tutorial, we're going to extend the first-person character controller that we created in one of my previous videos. So we will create a custom sprint input. While the player is holding down the button associated with that input, the player controller will move at a faster speed. And we'll create the sprinting functionality in such a way that you can only start sprinting while you're on the ground. And if you jump while you're sprinting, it'll maintain that speed in the air. So all I've got here in my scene is the player controller we set up from the last video. So here's my capsule with the character controller and the player controller script. And then my main camera as a child of the capsule with the mouse look script attached to it. So we'll start by defining the custom input before we write any code. So to define a new input, I'm going to go to Edit, and then access the project settings. And we want to make sure we have the input manager selected and the axes array expanded. So here are all the axes that are defined by default in Unity. You'll notice some of the ones that we used to create the base functionality for the player controller. So there's the horizontal and vertical inputs, and they're also down here. So the difference between these two here is that these two are associated with joystick axes, whereas these inputs at the top here are associated with keyboard inputs, which we can see in their negative and positive input buttons. And the same goes for the jump input. So here's our keyboard one, and then here is our joystick one here. So we want to define a brand new input. We want to add one more to this list. So I'm just going to change the size of the axes array to 19, which will add one more to the list, and it will copy the last one. So this cancel input was the last one. So it's just duplicated the properties for that input. So first we'll change the name. Now this one is going to be sprint with a capital S. Now this is also going to be a key or mouse button. Well, it's going to be a keyboard button in this case. It's also not going to be an axis, so we only need to give it a positive input rather than a negative one as well. That also means we don't need to play around with the gravity, dead, or sensitivity values. So first of all, we'll change our positive button here. So while this button is pressed, the sprint will be activated. So I'm going to set this to left shift. And the alt positive button is like we can have a second button mapped to that as well. So in this case, I don't actually want anything there. So I'm just going to clear that out completely. And that's all we need to do in order to set that sprint input up. So now we can use this sprint input in our code and have functionality associated with certain buttons. So let's close the project settings here. And then we want to open our player controller script. We want to modify this. So I'll double click on this in the project window. Okay. So here's our script that we created in the last video. So we're going to start by creating some variables. And the first one that we're going to create is going to be a serialized private variable. And we'll make it a float, and we'll call it sprint multiplier. And we'll give a default value of 2. Okay, so aside from that, we also need to create some auto properties. So I'm going to create them underneath the can move auto property. So, and these are going to be private because they only need to be used within the context of the player controller class. So the first one is going to be a private float, and we'll call it sprint speed. And this is going to be a getter. It's going to be a read-only property. And when we read it, we want to return the default move speed multiplied by our sprint multiplier. So that's going to give us our sprint speed. Now, the reason I'm putting that inside an auto property is because it's a float. I've had some issues later on in the update if we don't put this inside a property. So this is just mitigating those floating point errors. Okay, so after that, we're going to have a private boolean, and we'll call this one sprinting. And again, this is just going to be a read-only property, so it's going to be a getter. And when we read this, we want to return true or false based on whether our current speed is equal to our sprint speed. Okay, so let's just add some method summaries for these properties. So for our sprint speed, we'll say returns the sprint speed. And then for sprinting, we'll say returns true if player is currently sprinting. And that should do us for our method summaries. Okay, so next we'll move down to the update method. And we're going to come in right here. So this is the last little bit of code we need. And we're going to write this right here. So if canMove is equal to true, and if our character controller component is grounded, this is where we're actually going to check for our inputs. So we'll open an if statement, and we'll say if input dot get button up. Okay, now we're doing this in sort of a special order here. So we're going to check if get button up is equal to true, and we're checking for the button associated with the sprint input. So this is checking if the sprint button was currently released on the frame that's currently being executed. So if we've released the sprint button, then we want to set our current speed back to our default speed. So we'll say current speed is equal to default move speed, and that will reset the speed back to the normal speed. Now, if we haven't released that input this frame, we want to check for something else. So we'll use an else if statement to counter that if statement, and we'll check if input.getButton is equal to true. So getButton is returning if the button associated with the input we're passing it, which will be sprint here. If that button is being held down, then it's going to execute this if statement instead. So here, we're just going to say current speed is equal to sprint speed. Now, you might think that that's it, but we actually need to define one more if statement to counter that. So we'll say else if. So let's think about the conditions under which this sort of pattern here is executing. So it's only executing when the controller is grounded. So if the sprint input is detected to have been released while we're on the ground, that's all good. And if we're on the ground and holding it down, that's all good. It's going to set us to start sprinting or continue sprinting. But what if we're not grounded and we release the sprint input, right? Well, when we land back on the ground, this won't execute because it's not the frame that the button was released. And this won't execute because the button's not being held down anymore. But if we were in the air and released it, then this will never have happened, meaning when we land, we're still going to be moving at our sprint speed. So we need to just check in the worst case scenario, if sprinting is still equal to true after those other two if statements have executed, then we're sprinting when we shouldn't be. So here we'll just say current speed is equal to default move speed again. And that should be it. So now I should be able to save the script. Actually, before I save the script, just to demonstrate, I'm going to come up here and serialize our current speed variable. And this is just temporary. I'll come and unserialize this shortly. So now I'll save the script and let's go into Unity and see what happens. Okay, so I'm back in Unity now. Before I go into play mode, I'm just going to select my capsule here. And we can see we've got this sprint multiplier variable. And we can change that to change how quickly we're going to sprint. So currently when we sprint, we're going to move twice as fast as when we're moving normally. So it's going to double our move speed. So our current speed will be 7 while we are sprinting. So we have this current speed variable here as well. Now again, we're not going to set this to anything because this gets set while the game is running. I've just serialized it so that we can watch it to sort of debug it while the game's executing. So let's hit play and test it out. Okay, so I'm in play mode. So if I move around, we can see current speed is set to 3.5. If I hold shift, our current speed moves to 7. And if I release it, it goes back to 3.5. If I hold shift and then jump and then release, it stays at 7 until we land. If I hold shift and then jump and then keep it held down, it stays at 7 when we land. And yeah, if we jump at 3.5 and start trying to sprint in the air, it doesn't work. again with the double jump. And yeah, that's about it really. So that's it for this video, a nice and quick one for a change. Now I am actually planning on extending this functionality in an upcoming video. So in the Floor is Lava game series that I've been doing recently, I'm planning on integrating a sort of stamina value with this sprint function so that you can only sprint while you have stamina and while your stamina is not recharging. And we'll also create a bar on the user interface to show the player how much stamina they currently have. So if this video helped you and you enjoyed it, please leave a like. If you'd like to see more game dev tutorials and content like this, then you can subscribe if you like. Thanks for watching this video. Have a great day.